Hello. This is a short lesson and experiential practice in how to work with the inner critic. And I'm aware of the challenge that may be even driving why you clicked on this video, in the sense that the critical structure in many of us goes so deep that we often mistake it for us. So, in other words, the humor here may be that if you are the kind of person who would click on a "How to Love Your Inner Critic" video, it may very well be that your critic is activated, that you have an agenda, that by the end of this video you will be rid of your critic. And hallelujah, and it isn't quite going to be the way in. So I'm just beginning with the end in mind here. So in Gestalt therapy, there's a model often used called top dog, underdog. And the top dog is the more conscious, often more developed side of an internal conflict we're having. And so I am guessing that if you believe you have a strong inner critic, that and you're uncomfortable with that in any way, that there's a conflict inside, and that you're likely seeing the top dog side of that conflict much more than the underdog. So, in other words, if there is a strong inner critic, the top dog that's conscious or activated regularly in your life, there is also what might be an audience to that critic, or an object of criticism that might be less developed, or an underdog. It's kind of the part, it's the part of us that's being beat up by the critic. And that part is, I'm assuming that part is more likely less conscious than the critic itself. And so this practice is going to be to make both the top dog and underdog, as well as their dynamic, more conscious in you. So we'll begin with the more developed part. And again, I am assuming that you have a more developed critic, or more conscious critic, than audience. And this practice could work if it's the other way around. If you are more aware of the part that's activated, that is constantly, say, rejecting criticism, and the critic is a more quiet voice, this practice will work for that. But I'm explaining this through the practice of inner critic dominance, say, in this case. Okay, so the first step then is we'll look at the top dog. And what I'd like you to do is take your time with each of these steps. What we're trying to do is first clarify both the top dog and underdog. And if these parts aren't clear enough, or they're not sufficiently in the light of awareness, none of the further steps will be of much use. And so please take on a spirit of patience here, and make sure that you've done each step in a way that you feel is fairly complete. Okay? So you can always pause the video. I do suggest you get a pen and paper, because we'll be doing a little bit of writing, and we'll begin. Okay, step one is to bring the top dog, the inner critic, or the superego structure, the critical parent, or the driver, whatever it is for you, that is constantly looking to improve us in some way. And I'd like you to actually step into that part as a first person perspective. In other words, be the critic, if you might. And just begin to write down, what is your worldview? What is your voice? What do you want? And what do you think needs to happen? What's your aim? Just start writing down some ideas from your worldview. What we really want here is to get a full perspective of the voice of the inner critic. Okay, so after your step one is your top dog is fairly clarified. This might be the easier side of the conflict for you to identify. Let's move on to the audience of that critic, or of that top dog, or that superego critical parent voice. This may be a little more difficult for some of us. But just notice the, say, reaction that's going on to the inner critic. Sometimes the voice is quite meek. It's often quite young and undeveloped. And it may be a voice of protest, like, I just don't want to do this. Or I want to hide, I want to run, I'm afraid. Sometimes it's a bit of a rebel, like, no, I will not do this. I will not listen, I will not budge. But just notice what the underdog, the part that's the audience to the critic, and take your time to write down its voice, noticing that it's a bit more likely to be more vulnerable than the critic itself. Now, when that step is completed, just take a moment to reflect on your life where this motif is often activated. So in other words, there may be something in your life that you're not satisfied with, such as your diet or exercise, or an addiction, something like that. And just notice and list all the areas in your life that you have this top dog kind of criticizing you, and an underdog where you're defending or avoiding that criticism. Just notice how often this comes up. It could be quite startling to see how active the top dog underdog structure is within you. Now, if the top dog and underdog are sufficiently clarified in your awareness, you will be able to hold them together. In other words, you might notice that, say, the top dog, the critic, was more like 75% in your awareness, and the underdog was only 25 or something like that. And what we're trying to do is allow the underdog to have a bit more percentage, say, of our awareness, to kind of let it build, let it become more conscious in a way that these parts become a little bit more equal in terms of their availability to awareness. If you've been able to do that, you should then be able to hold both sides at once. So hold both the top dog and the underdog in your awareness, and notice the conflict in between them. Notice that there's a kind of a civil war going on, each with its own perspective, and that there's actually you could say an energy or a conflict or a relationship between them, which is quite uncomfortable, actually. So what I'd like you to do now is take your time to clarify this third step of holding both the inner critic, the top dog, and kind of the victim, the underdog, in awareness all at once, and to just allow that to be. Just allow it to be experienced in your awareness. Notice for a moment, if you're able to hold the whole conflict in awareness, even if that's a fleeting experience, that actually there is a third perspective online right now that is able to watch or take some distance from the top dog and the underdog. There's actually a part of you that's taking perspective on the conflict because you're feeling the conflict or experiencing the conflict in some way. So just notice there is a third sort of part or perspective available to you right now. So continue to clarify the conflict itself until you can see and stabilize that third part, as well as the individual parts, the top dog and the underdog. Really maybe make a commitment here to not move on in the steps until you have a real sense of the parts of the conflict and the conflict itself from a different third-person perspective. So now drop the perspective of the third part, and we're going to return to working with each of the individual parts, the top dog and the underdog. Beginning with the top dog or the critic, we want to do a little bit more inquiry here and see, what does the top dog ultimately want? What's its real basic intent? And so if you might just ask the top dog, what does it really want for you, for your name? Like, top dog, what do you really want for Chad? And it'll become pretty clear that the top dog wants some kind of better or improved version of Chad. That it is striving and driven in some way to make you better, or a more ideal version of yourself. And then if you can just write down what that ideal version is, you need to be more this, you need to be more that, whatever. Just allow that critic to have its voice. But take it a step further and ask the top dog, if everything on this list that you want done was completed. In other words, imagine yourself right now as having completed all of the things that are on the list of the top dog. Imagine you've just done it, that it's completed itself. What would the top dog experience if the list were complete? And get an actual sense of that. There'll be a kind of satisfaction or a kind of relaxation that might occur. It's almost as if the top dog has completed itself out of a job in a way. without pushing it away, but it's like, I've done my job so well, so fully, that I could finally enjoy a Saturday, something like that. Just get a felt sense of what that completion or satisfaction or relaxation would be, and write down a few words. This is the ultimate intent of the inner critic. It's the intent before the intent becomes an agenda. Next, we'll address the underdog in quite the same way. So we begin by really asking our underdog, what is it that you want? What do you want from the inner critic? What do you want the inner critic to do? Allow it to take up its space in the conflict once again. And rather than, and this is tricky, we may notice if the critic sort of slips in here. See if you can keep it separate from the underdog. But just notice what happens if you allow that underdog to do what it wants to do. In other words, allow it to run, allow it to hide, allow it to whine, allow it to rebel. Just kind of observe what it wants to do and let it have free range of this side of the conflict for now. And what would it ultimately feel if it got what it wanted? If it did get to hide, if it did get to dissociate or check out, if it did have its voice heard, I don't want to. This is too hard. Fuck off. What if it actually had its voice completely heard? What would it experience? Imagine this part was fully seen in some way. Notice what it might experience if its kind of perspective were totally given, all its rights, and it didn't have to hide anymore. It didn't have to complain anymore. It didn't have to do anything anymore, because it was being accepted just as it is, without any manipulation or criticism. Just get a felt sense of what this might be. And write down a few words of what its function or main intent is in this conflict. So now let's return again to holding the conflict as a whole. We now know the, agenda or worldview of each side of the conflict. And we also have clarified its more pure intent. That both sides of this do actually want something that we could call inherently good for you. And so hold this conflict, both the top dog and the underdog, together from another perspective again. Notice that there's another perspective kind of looking at or looking down on this conflict. And see if that perspective might have anything to say or any insight into the conflict itself, or what might be helpful for this conflict to continue to be explored or resolved completely. Just notice what might be revealing itself to this third-person perspective. Just notice the wisdom that might arise from being able to see the whole conflict and each of its parts from a new perspective. Now, finally, I just want to offer you one more huge opportunity for how to look at this conflict of the inner critic and the audience or the recipient of the inner critic. And that is, you may notice that even the advice that the third perspective gave to the conflict or to each part, that the top dog may have a propensity to take that advice and make it an agenda item. So if the top dog has made the wisdom an agenda item, and you've noticed that, celebrate, because you have just noticed the arising of the critical structure in awareness. You've just noticed that the critic is criticizing the critic. That is a real opportunity to celebrate rather than criticize yourself. Because if you're criticizing yourself for that, you're likely in the structure itself. And to just notice how pernicious this structure might be. And realize that the only way sort of out of this structure is to leave the entire conflict alone. In other words, don't get in conflict with the conflict. If you're in one side, allow one side to be arising. If you're in the other side, the underdog, allow that to be arising. Because likely anything you are doing has been a very fast series of steps that you've missed. Going from, for example, the critical part having a very good intent for you. The intent to want something better for you. And how quickly and out of consciousness that intent becomes an agenda to fix yourself. The agenda to fix yourself is the conflict working on the conflict. So is there another way? Enjoy that exploration. All we need to do, quite possibly, is to repeat these steps enough times to clarify the top dog, clarify the underdog, get to know its perspective, get to know its deepest intent, get to understand that this is a conflict that's been going on for eons in us, and that in a way, from the perspective of the structure, there is no way out. Any instruction we give ourselves to get out is likely the structure working on the structure. So just leave it alone. Allow it to be. See if you might stop rejecting the critic and see its intent. See if you might stop rejecting the victim and child and give it some healing. Keep running this process through the washing machine of awareness.